She didn't vanish without a trace. She vanished with $650,000 sitting in an account that nobody was talking about. That number is why you're here. And by the end of this episode, that number is going to change everything you thought you knew about this case. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? What's the weather like where you are today? This community has been following every thread of this case since the 4th of April, 2026. And tonight, we're pulling the one thread that changes the entire picture. Here is what Ashleigh Banfield confirmed through former AT&T colleagues and sources with direct knowledge of the Hooker finances on her show Drop Dead Serious. Lynette Hooker had a retirement account, a 401k, built over years of consistent, disciplined employment at AT&T, and at the time this reporting was completed, that account held upwards of $650,000. Confirmed, sourced, on the record. Now hold that number for a second. Don't move past it yet, because on the other side of that number is Brian Hooker, also a former AT&T employee, also someone who had access to the exact same retirement structure, the same employer-sponsored 401k, the same institutional opportunity to build long-term financial security, same company, same door, completely different outcome. Brian's retirement account, according to Banfield sourcing, was gone, burned through entirely. Not reduced, not partially withdrawn, gone. Zero on one side, upwards of $650,000 on the other, and the woman whose name was on that account has been missing since the 4th of April, 2026. That asymmetry is not a rumor circulating in the true crime community. It is a confirmed financial fact. And when you place it carefully against everything else this case has produced, the boat, the Bahamas, the lifestyle, the phone call 3 weeks before she disappeared, the picture does not look the same. Ask yourself this. If you were the investigator sitting across from that financial record for the first time, what would you be writing down? This is Ola Detective Files. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe now. This channel covers only what is confirmed, only what is sourced, and only what actually moves the needle on the cases that matter. You don't want to miss what's coming next, because the $650,000 is just the beginning. The question of who stood to benefit from it and what the legal architecture around a missing person's retirement account actually looks like, that question has not been answered publicly yet. And when it is, it will reframe this entire case. Stay with us. Before the boat, before the Bahamas, before any of this, there was a woman who showed up to work every single day and quietly built something real. Lynette Hooker was not a headline before the 4th of April, 2026. She was a career professional, an AT&T employee, the kind of person that former colleagues described the same way every single time without being prompted. Reliable, warm, genuinely well-liked. Not in the performative way that people say about someone after something happens to them, in the specific, consistent way that only comes from someone who actually showed up and made the people around her feel it. Every former colleague Banfield spoke to said the same thing. They really liked Lynette, that consistency matters. It tells you something about who she was before the sailing life, before the Soulmate, before the version of her life that got photographed and shared and captioned for an audience. Because there were two versions of Lynette Hooker's life. There was the one that existed in documents, the paycheck stubs, the contribution statements, the retirement account that grew quietly and steadily over years of unglamorous, disciplined work. And there was the one that existed in photographs, the open water, the Bahamas sky. The life that looked from the outside like a choice made freely by two people who had decided that conventional living wasn't for them. What the photographs never showed was the financial biography underneath, the decades of consistent contribution, the repeated decision, across hundreds of individual moments, to leave that retirement account untouched while everything else around it was being spent, sold, or committed to someone else's vision of the future, that discipline is not accidental. You don't arrive at upwards of $650,000 by accident. You arrive there by choosing over and over again not to touch it. And that choice, quiet, unglamorous, and completely invisible in every photograph ever taken of the sailing life, is the most important financial decision Lynette Hooker ever made. The question is whether someone else knew exactly how important it was. Picture this: open water, blue sky stretching in every direction. A 4-6-foot Morgan sailing sloop cutting through the Bahamas on a Tuesday morning like the rest of the world simply doesn't exist. That was the image. That was the version that got shared. Now ask yourself what it actually cost to produce it. The Soulmate, that's the name of the vessel. A 4-6-foot Morgan sailing sloop that became the physical center of Brian and Lynette Hooker's life together. Not a vacation boat. Not a weekend escape. A home. Confirmed by Banfield's reporting for Brian Hooker, the Soulmate was the only home. No land-based property, no apartment. No backup address somewhere on the mainland. The boat was it, and Lynette funded it. Not partially, not as an equal financial partner splitting costs down the middle. Banfield sourcing is direct on this point. They ended up selling everything. Lynette had a land-based life before the Soulmate. Property, conventional assets, the kind of financial infrastructure that people build during working years when the future still looks like something stable and predictable. All of it was liquidated, converted, directed toward the sailing life that Brian wanted, the boat in Florida, the warm weather, the open water. Brian wanted the boat, Brian wanted the Bahamas, and Lynette sold everything she had built on land to make that possible. Everything except one account. The retirement fund stayed, while every other asset moved outward toward the shared life on the Soulmate. That 401k sat untouched, growing, protected, structurally secured in her name alone, an account that no partner can access without explicit authorization, regardless of the relationship, regardless of the lifestyle built around it. She gave this life everything she had: her property, her savings, her land-based future. But not that. Now, here's what you need to understand going into the next part of this story. The financial gap between these two people wasn't just about retirement accounts. It was about power, about options, about who could walk away from this life if they needed to, and who could not afford to let them. What the financial records revealed when Banfield sources finally laid them out side by side will make you stop and look at this case completely differently. Investigators who work financial motive cases have a specific process. They don't start with the crime scene. They start with the paperwork, the account statements, the retirement disclosures, the wire transfer records, the quiet, unglamorous documentation of who had what, who spent what, and who was left standing with something when everything else fell apart. When that process was applied to the financial biography of Brian and Lynette Hooker, what it produced was not a complicated picture. It was a stark one. Both of them worked at AT&T. That fact is confirmed. Both of them, through that employment, had access to the exact same financial tool, an employer-sponsored 401k retirement plan, the same institutional structure, the same basic opportunity to build long-term security through contributions made during their working years. Same company, same starting line, same door. What each of them chose to do with that door is where the story splits permanently. Lynette's account grew quietly, consistently, across years of disciplined contribution and an equally disciplined decision never to withdraw. By the time Banfield sources described what that account contained, it held upwards of $650,000. Confirmed through former AT&T colleagues and sources with direct knowledge of the Hooker finances. Stated clearly on Drop Dead Serious, the floor of that figure is $650,000. The actual balance may be higher. This production uses Banfield's exact language upwards of, because that is the accurate and honest thing to do. Brian's account told a completely different story. Gone. That is Banfield's characterization, drawn directly from her sourcing. Not reduced, not partially accessed, not sitting at a lower balance after some reasonable withdrawals. Gone. Whatever that account once held from his years at AT&T no longer existed. The mechanism, the timeline, the specific decisions that produce that outcome, none of that is confirmed in the public record at the time this episode is produced. What is confirmed, plainly and without qualification, is the result. 0. Now place those two figures side by side the way a financial investigator would. Write them down. 0 on one side, upwards of $650,000 on the other. Both figures belonging to two people who were living together on a boat in the Bahamas when one of them disappeared. Here is what that asymmetry tells an investigator immediately. It tells them who had options and who did not. A 401k account held in one person's name alone is structurally protected. A partner cannot access it. A joint financial entanglement cannot reach it. It belongs irrevocably and exclusively to the person named on the account. That person was Lynette, which means Lynette had a financial foundation that was entirely independent of Brian, entirely beyond his reach, and entirely available to her if she ever decided to use it. Brian had no equivalent foundation, no retirement savings, no independent financial position that did not depend on assets connected to Lynette or the life they shared on the Soulmate. The question that a financial investigator writes down at this point is never simply who had more. It is who had something to lose and who had something to gain, and what the stakes were for each person if the arrangement ended. Ask yourself that question right now. Sit with it for a moment before this story moves forward, because the next piece of this case, the phone call, the airport, the 10 minutes, is where that financial picture stops being background information and starts being the only context that makes the timeline make sense. That number didn't fall from the sky. Upwards of $650,000 in a retirement account is not something that happens to a person. It is something a person builds deliberately, quietly, over a span of time that most people underestimate when they hear the figure and move past it too quickly toward the next detail. Think about what that accumulation actually requires. It requires years, often decades of consistent employment. It requires a contribution pulled from every paycheck before the spending decisions are made, before the groceries, before the bills, before whatever the month demands. It requires showing up to work on the days when showing up feels like the smallest possible version of a life. And it requires one decision, repeated across hundreds of individual moments, when the account balance is visible and the temptation or the pressure to access it is real, the decision to leave it alone. You don't build upwards of $650,000 by accident. You build it by choosing over and over again not to spend it. Now, place that discipline inside the specific context of Lynette Hooker's financial life. She was not building that retirement account in a vacuum. She was building it while simultaneously liquidating every other asset she owned to fund the sailing life, the property, the land-based savings. The conventional financial infrastructure of a life she had spent years constructing before the Soulmate ever entered the picture. All of it went outward. All of it was committed to the shared life on the water. And through every single one of those outward financial commitments, the retirement account stayed. It grew. It was protected. It never moved. That is not passive financial behavior. That is a person who, consciously or not, maintained one line that did not get crossed regardless of what everything else around it was doing, the floor beneath the floor, the last protected thing standing when everything else had already been given away. What that instinct ultimately meant for Lynette, and whether someone else understood exactly what that account represented, is the question this case keeps returning to. Let's stop and look at this clearly, not with emotion, not with assumption, just with the confirmed facts laid out in the order that an investigator would lay them out one line at a time until the full picture is visible. Brian Hooker has no retirement savings. That is confirmed through Banfield sourcing. The $401k from his AT&T career is gone. Not reduced, not partially accessible, gone. Whatever that account once represented as a financial foundation no longer exists. The Soulmate, the 6-foot Morgan sailing sloop currently sitting on a mooring ball in Marsh Harbor, Bahamas, is, according to Banfield's confirmed reporting, Brian's only home. Not one asset among several, not a boat he owns alongside a property somewhere on the mainland. The only home, the complete picture of his residential and financial life at the point Lynette disappeared, was a single vessel on the water in another country. Brian Hooker is not on that vessel. He is in Michigan. He has not returned to the Bahamas since leaving. That is confirmed. No permanent land-based residence in the Bahamas. No permanent land-based residence confirmed in Michigan either. A man with no retirement savings, no land-based property, and a boat sitting unoccupied in a country he has left and not returned to. Hold that picture steady for a moment, because what it describes is not a position of financial stability. It is not a position from which a person can independently build or sustain a life without access to money or assets that are not currently in their possession or their name. And the person who had been providing the financial foundation for the life they shared, the person in whose retirement account upwards of $650,000 was sitting untouched, secured, and protected, has been missing since the 4th of April 2026. Now here is where the picture gets more specific. A 6-foot sailing sloop in reasonable condition represents a meaningful asset on the open market, but it cannot be sold from Michigan. Not without returning to the Bahamas. Not without engaging legal and logistical processes that involve the very place Brian has not gone back to. It is an asset that is, for all practical purposes, unreachable from a distance. Brian Hooker has not been charged in connection with Lynette Hooker's disappearance. That fact is confirmed and stated clearly. The investigation remains active, but the financial record does not change because no charges have been filed. The numbers are what they are. And right now, those numbers point directly toward a phone call that happened 3 weeks before April 4th, a call that, once you understand the full financial picture behind it, sounds completely different than it did the first time you heard about it. 3 weeks before Lynette Hooker disappeared, she had already made a decision, not a thought, not a conversation about whether to make one. A decision that had already been acted upon, already been converted into a purchased, dated plane ticket representing a departure that was no longer hypothetical. She was not considering leaving, she was leaving. The bag was packed or it wasn't, and it didn't matter. Every threshold between thinking and doing had already been crossed. She was 10 minutes from the airport. That detail comes from Rachel Shaw, a friend of Lynette's, named on the record speaking directly to Ashleigh Banfield on Drop Dead Serious. Rachel confirmed that when Lynette called her on the 11th of March 2026, she was 10 minutes from the airport with a ticket in her hand. She told Banfield that things were really bad, that Lynette was in tears, that she told her clearly and without hesitation, get on the plane. 10 minutes from an airport with a purchased ticket is not a person in the early stages of contemplating an exit. It is a person who has already done the contemplating, already made the calls, already converted the intention into logistics. The ticket was real, the transportation to the airport was real, the 10 minutes were real. Now, place that moment inside the financial picture this episode has been building. Lynette Hooker had upwards of $650,000 in her AT&T retirement account, confirmed, protected, in her name alone, structurally inaccessible to anyone who was not her. She had sold every other asset she owned to fund the sailing life, the property, the land-based savings, the conventional financial infrastructure of a life that existed before the Soulmate. All of it was gone. But the retirement account was still there, still growing, still hers. Which means on the 11th of March, 2026, standing 10 minutes from that airport, Lynette Hooker was not financially trapped. She had the means, she had the ticket, she had a friend on the other end of the line telling her exactly what to do. She went back. Rachel Shaw confirmed it to Banfield. It is on the record, it is not disputed. Lynette turned away from that gate and returned to the Soulmate. Returned to Brian. And 3 weeks later, on the 4th of April, 2026, she was gone. Ask yourself what happens in those 10 minutes. Not emotionally, forensically. A person with financial independence, a purchased exit, and direct instruction from someone who cared about her outcome makes a calculation in those 10 minutes that overrides all of it. What does that calculation look like? What does it weigh? What does it conclude that is more compelling than a ticket, a friend, and upwards of $650,000 waiting on the other side of departure? That is the question that sits at the center of this case and refuses to move. Because here is what the 6-minute mark of this story demands you sit with. The confirmed facts and the confirmed timeline produce a gap that no photograph, no Instagram caption, and no curated version of the sailing life can close. Lynette had everything she needed to leave. She was in the act of leaving. And something in those 10 minutes reversed a decision that had already been made, already been ticketed, already been set in motion. What that something was has not been confirmed. But the financial record makes one thing permanently clear. Whatever brought her back, it was not the money. The money was always there. The money was never the barrier. Something else was. And 3 weeks after she went back to it, Lynette Hooker was no longer aboard the Soulmate. This is the part of the story that most true crime coverage skips past. And skipping it is a mistake. Because the question every person watching this has already asked is the obvious one. If Lynette Hooker had upwards of $650,000 in a protected account, in her name alone, if she had the ticket, the friend on the phone, the 10 minutes, the financial foundation, why didn't she go? That question deserves a real answer. Not a dismissal, not a deflection, a forensic one. What researchers and clinicians who work cases involving coercive dynamics document consistently across decades of documented case studies and behavioral analysis is this. The decision to leave a controlling or dangerous situation is not primarily a financial calculation, it is a risk calculation, and those two things are not the same. The moment of departure is, statistically, the most consequential moment in a controlling dynamic. The fear that drives a person back from an airport gate 10 minutes away is not the fear of being unable to afford a new life. It is the fear of what happens during the departure and immediately after it. The fear of whether the distance will be enough, whether the person being left will accept it, whether leaving makes the situation better or whether it makes it catastrophically worse. A retirement account with upwards of $650,000 does not resolve that calculation. A plane ticket does not answer that fear. Financial independence is necessary, but it is not sufficient. It never has been. There is also the weight of what Lynette was leaving behind. She had sold everything to make this life possible. Walking away from the Soulmate was not simply leaving a relationship. It was leaving the only life she still had, acknowledging, standing 10 minutes from a gate, that everything she had liquidated and committed and given to this arrangement had not produced what was promised. That weight is real. And it does not dissolve because the money exists. Sometimes the size of what a person is given to something makes the threshold harder to cross, not easier. The money was always there. The door was always open. And yet on the 11th of March 2026, Lynette Hooker walked away from both. What that tells investigators about the full architecture of the situation she was living inside is something this case has not yet fully answered. But it is being asked loudly, and the answers, when they come, will matter. The 4th of April, 2026. That date is now part of the public record. It is the last date on which Lynette Hooker was accounted for aboard the Soulmate in Bahamian waters. Not a rumor, not a community estimate, a confirmed timeline that law enforcement, Banfield sourcing, and the active missing person investigation have all placed on the record. 3 weeks after she turned away from that airport gate, 3 weeks after the ticket, the call, the 10 minutes, 3 weeks after every financial and logistical condition for leaving was already in place, and she went back anyway. And then she was gone. The investigation is active. Law enforcement involvement has been confirmed. The full scope of which specific agencies are involved and what the current state of the investigation looks like has not been publicly disclosed at the time this episode is produced. What is confirmed is that this case has not been closed, Lynette Hooker has not been found, and the financial picture that Banfield put on the record has introduced a set of questions into this investigation that have not yet been answered publicly. Those questions are specific, and they matter. The first one is the beneficiary question. Lynette Hooker's AT&T retirement account holds upwards of $650,000. That account is in her name, it is protected, but every retirement account has a named beneficiary, a person designated to receive those funds in the event of the account holder's passing. Who is named on Lynette Hooker's account has not been confirmed publicly. That information has not entered the public record. And until it does, it represents one of the most significant, unresolved financial threads in this entire case. The second question is legal. What does the process actually look like for accessing a missing person's retirement funds? What can be done before a death is legally established? What requires a court proceeding? What requires a formal declaration? What timeline does that process involve? None of that has been confirmed in the context of this specific case. The third question is structural. Did Brian and Lynette hold any financial instruments jointly? Shared accounts? Shared property? Shared debt? Whether any joint financial architecture existed between them has not been confirmed. Banfield has stated explicitly that a dedicated Follow the Money episode on the Hooker finances is in development on Drop Dead Serious. That episode will go further than what this production covers. It will address the beneficiary designation, it will address the legal framework, it will address the complete financial architecture of what the life on the Soulmate actually looked like beneath the surface. That episode has not yet aired. When it does, this community will be here for it. Because the confirmed picture is already stark enough on its own, and the questions it leaves open are not peripheral details. They are the center of what this case still needs to answer. Here is where this episode ends. Not with speculation, not with a theory, with the confirmed facts stated plainly in the order that they matter. Lynette Hooker, AT&T career, $401K intact at the time of her disappearance, upwards of $650,000, confirmed through Banfield sourcing. Built over decades of disciplined, consistent work and an equally disciplined decision never to withdraw, every other asset she owned sold, committed to the sailing life, the retirement account untouched, the last protected thing, hers alone. Brian Hooker, AT&T career, $401K gone, confirmed, the Soulmate his only home sitting on a mooring ball in Marsh Harbor, Bahamas, unoccupied, Brian in Michigan. No permanent land-based residence confirmed, no retirement savings confirmed, no independent financial position that does not depend on assets connected to Lynette or the life they shared. The 11th of March, 2026. The ticket, the call, Rachel Shaw on the record, 10 minutes from the airport, she went back, the 4th of April, 2026. Lynette Hooker was no longer aboard the Soulmate. The investigation is active. No charges have been filed against anyone in connection with her disappearance. Brian Hooker is presumed innocent. The beneficiary question is unanswered. The legal framework around her retirement account remains outside the public record. The Follow the Money episode Banfield has committed to has not yet aired. But the financial picture is now visible. It is in the public conversation where it belongs. And this community is not done following every confirmed thread until there is a real answer. Lynette Hooker has been missing since the 4th of April, 2026. She is not forgotten. If this kind of sourced, careful, forensic coverage is what keeps you coming back, subscribe right now. Hit the notification bell. Share this episode with someone who has been following this case. Every comment, every share, every subscription tells the algorithm that this story matters and keeps this work going. We will be here when the next confirmed piece of this case comes to light, and we will not stop until there is an answer.